The castles of medieval Europe are often remembered in stone and silence, gray towers rising against the sky, walls thick enough to withstand sieges, and banners fluttering proudly above. Yet within those walls, life was never only about battles, kings and queens. The truth of a castle lay in its shadows as much as in its throne rooms. Beyond the torchlit halls, in narrow corridors, in the soft candlelight of hidden chambers, another world quietly existed. It was a world of women who were never named in chronicles, yet who shaped the desires, the moods, and sometimes even the decisions of the men who held power. These were the prostitutes of the castle, women whose beauty, secrets, and forbidden liaison threaded themselves silently into the fabric of medieval life. To the outside world, the castle was a fortress of virtue, a place of Christian piety and noble duty. But to those who lived inside, the reality was far more complicated. Men who spent months at war, knights who bled on battlefields, and nobles weighed down by the burdens of lineage all sought comfort in ways unspoken. Behind the heavy oak doors, in the glow of candle flames, women offered not only their bodies but also their presence, their laughter, their fragrance, and sometimes even a tender illusion of love. The chronicles never wrote of them, yet their lives pulsed beneath the surface, as real and as human as the kings and queens above them. They were not all the same. Some were poor village girls drawn into the castle by circumstance, perhaps a family too hungry to feed them, or a promise made by a steward eager to please his lord. Others were courtesans of higher bearing, skilled in the arts of charm, conversation, and beauty, women who could stand in silk beside a nobleman and not look out of place. Their beauty was their livelihood, but it was also their armor, and every detail of their appearance mattered. For them, maintaining allure was not vanity, it was survival. By day, they were nearly invisible. A casual glance from a passing squire might catch the shimmer of hair brushed until it gleamed, or the faint hint of herbs used as perfume. But the women moved quietly, unnoticed in the bustle of the kitchens, the stables, and the halls. By night, the story changed. As the castle settled into its silence, doors closed, footsteps hushed, and within chambers where velvet curtains muted the world, the women stepped into their hidden roles. Here, beauty was no accident. It was carefully tended, shaped, and sustained through practices passed in whispers from one woman to another. The perfumes were not the bottled luxuries we imagine today, but simple mixtures of rosemary, lavender, and rose petals steeped in oils, rubbed onto wrists, neck, and hair, until a man who leaned close could not forget the scent. Faces were touched with powders ground from chalk, rice, or even crushed flowers, a faint blush pressed upon lips with berries, when a noble's feast might lead to an invitation behind closed doors. Their hair, the crown of beauty in an age where veils and braids carried meaning, was brushed endlessly, 100 strokes or more, until it shone in the firelight. To men who spent their days armored in steel, the softness of such care was irresistible. And yet, beyond beauty, there was a deeper secret. These women carried with them a kind of knowledge, a subtle reading of men, a way of discerning their moods, their hidden fears, their unspoken desires. Knights who returned from bloody campaigns longed not only for flesh, but for a moment of release, a space where they could let go of the weight of honor and cruelty. Nobles, trapped in marriages of duty, found in these women the fantasy of affection, freely given. And in that exchange, the prostitutes of the castle gained something beyond coin. They gained access to secrets whispered in half-sleep, to plots and schemes spoken without thought, to confessions that could tilt the fate of kingdoms if they were ever uttered beyond those bedchambers. For the women themselves, survival was not only about pleasing, but about guarding what they learned, weaving it into silence, and sometimes using it as power when the moment required. Beauty was fragile in a world where illness and time could take it away, but secrets endured. The women who lasted long in the castle's shadows were those who knew how to wield both, the lure of their appearance and the weight of the whispers they carried. Life was not without danger. To be caught in the wrong man's chamber, to be seen where propriety forbade, could mean punishment, even death. But the castle itself was a labyrinth of shadows, with passageways known to the servants, locked doors that only a select few had the keys to, and chambers forgotten by all but those who needed them most. Within these stone walls, moments of intimacy bloomed like flowers in the cracks of stone, hidden, fragile, and easily trampled if exposed to the harsh light of judgment. The women understood the delicate balance. They adorned themselves with care, not in gaudy excess but in subtle touches that made men lean closer, that drew eyes without demanding them. They laughed softly, listened more than they spoke, and offered to men the illusion that they were not lords or knights or masters of war, but simply human, desiring, wounded, vulnerable. In return, the women asked for coin, for gifts, for favors, and sometimes, without asking at all, they received a kind of affection that bordered on love. In those quiet, hidden moments, the line between prostitute and mistress blurred, and history forgot the difference. And so, behind the castle walls, where banners declared honor and devotion, another world flourished in silence. A world where beauty was ritual, where figure was shaped by fasting and indulgence in equal measure, where love and desire twisted together like ivy, climbing a stone tower. A world never recorded in the chronicles of kings, but one that pulsed, with a truth too human, too forbidden, and too enduring to be erased. In the quiet heart of the medieval castle, beauty was not a luxury for the women who lived in shadows. It was survival. Behind closed doors, when the torches burned low and footsteps echoed less often in the halls, the prostitutes prepared themselves not with vanity alone, but with ritual. Every brushstroke through the hair, every mixture of herbs and oils, every whisper of color pressed against their lips was a calculated choice, a weapon as sharp as any knight's sword, though far more subtle. Beauty was their armor, fragrance, their banner, and appearance their most carefully guarded secret. Cosmetics in the medieval world were both mysterious and dangerous. The church frowned upon them, muttering sermons about sin and vanity, yet the truth was that even within monasteries and noble houses, recipes for beauty passed quietly from hand to hand. For the women of the castle's hidden chambers, these secrets were lifelines. They knew which powders to grind fine enough to smooth the complexion, how to blend chalk with crushed petals to soften the pallor of skin, how to darken lashes with soot to make eyes glimmer by candlelight. A touch of berry-stained lips could turn a weary night's glance into something warmer, more longing. These touches were not mere flourishes. They were silent invitations, hints of desire, and promises of closeness. Perfume, too, was an art. The great halls of the castle often smelled of smoke and sweat, of boiled meat and unwashed armor. Yet in the quiet alcoves where these women waited, the air was different. Sprigs of rosemary simmered in oil until it carried a sharp, clean scent. Lavender, dried and crushed, was steeped in vinegar and then dabbed lightly onto wrists. Rose petals, soaked for days in water, gave a faint, sweet fragrance that clung to hair and neck. A man who entered these chambers could not help but notice the sharpness of battle, the bitterness of politics, the odor of steel and horses fell away, replaced by a softness that belonged only to her. In such perfumes lay memory itself, for a man who returned to his duties carried with him the faintest echo of scent, one that haunted his thoughts long after the door had closed. Hair was no less important. In an age when noble women often covered theirs with veils and hoods, the prostitutes of the castle tended theirs in secret, letting it flow freely behind chamber doors. Hair was brushed until it shone in the firelight, braided with ribbons or left loose across shoulders in a way that seemed careless, though it was anything but. Some women rinsed it with chamomile to bring out golden hues, others with sage for darkness, or nettle for strength. A knight who touched it after weeks of holding only the coarse mane of his horse could not help but linger. In these strands of softness, a woman's allure deepened beyond the physical. It became a symbol of freedom, of indulgence, of everything a man was denied in the harshness of daily life. Yet beauty was not always safe. Some powders mixed with lead or arsenic promised pale skin at a terrible price. A woman's face might glow in candlelight one season and grow sickly the next. Still, many took the risk, for in the castle's unforgiving hierarchy, to lose beauty was to lose coin, to lose influence, to lose survival itself. And so they endured the stinging oils, the powders that clung too heavy, the perfumes that sometimes burned the skin. To the men who saw them, they seemed radiant, untouchable. Only the women themselves knew the price of that illusion. Preparation for the night was its own ritual. A basin of water, faintly scented with herbs, served as the beginning. The face was washed, the skin smoothed with oils pressed from almonds or olives. A mirror, often nothing more than polished metal, reflected back their image, and they studied it not with vanity but with a craftsman's eye. A hint of color on the lips, a shadow along the brows, a dab of oil along the neck. They practiced expressions, too, the half-smile that suggested intimacy, the lowered eyes that hinted at shyness, the laugh that promised warmth. They became not only beautiful but convincing, shaping themselves into the fantasy their clients longed for. The castle itself aided them in ways unspoken. Rich fabrics, stolen from storerooms or gifted by secret admirers, became part of their allure. A length of velvet draped across bare shoulders, silk ribbons tied carefully into hair, linen softened by repeated washing until it clung to the body. A prostitute's clothing was not meant for display in the halls, but for intimacy behind doors. Clothes chosen not for what they covered, but for how easily they slipped away. And in those moments, beauty became not just what was seen, but what was anticipated. But beauty was more than skin. These women knew that their fragrance and painted faces would draw men in, but it was their presence that kept them close. They laughed when laughter was needed, sighed at the right pauses, leaned forward just enough for a hand to brush against theirs. They studied men as much as they studied herbs and cosmetics. A knight who carried scars wanted gentleness. A lord burdened with intrigue craved distraction. A lonely squire longed for attention. The women adapted, transforming themselves as easily as they painted their lips, offering each man the illusion that he alone had found what he sought. And always behind it all was the unspoken knowledge that beauty and fragrance were masks. The women wore them not only to entice, but to protect. Without them, they were vulnerable, subject to judgment, dismissal, or worse. With them, they became untouchable, symbols of allure, guardians of secrets, keepers of desires. To men, they were objects of passion. To themselves, they were survivors. As the candles burned lower and footsteps hushed in the corridors, a kind of magic filled the hidden chambers. Painted faces leaned close to whisper words that blurred truth and illusion. Perfumed hair brushed against a knight's cheek. A figure, carefully tended and alluring, reclined in the flicker of firelight, promising comfort, escape, release. And while the world outside those stone walls remained harsh and unyielding, within the chamber beauty reigned, fragile yet commanding, both dangerous and irresistible. It was here, in these painted faces and perfumed moments, that the prostitutes of the castle carved their existence. Each stroke of powder, each drop of oil, each strand of brushed hair was more than adornment. It was survival. And behind their beauty lay the darker secret, that men, whether lords or soldiers, were not only seduced but disarmed. And sometimes, in that disarmament, the women held more power than history would ever allow their names to claim. Within the castle walls, beauty was not only about the painted face or the perfumed hair. It was about the entire figure, the way a body moved, the curve of a waist beneath linen, the softness or firmness of flesh revealed in flickering firelight. Men might be lured first by scent or smile, but their desire always lingered on the body, and the women knew this better than anyone. To maintain a figure of allure was not an indulgence, but a duty, a form of discipline as demanding as any knight's training with sword and shield. For the prostitutes who lived in the shadowed chambers of the castle, every meal, every sip, every movement was touched by the awareness that their livelihood depended on the shape of their bodies. They studied themselves not with vanity but with caution, knowing that a body too thin looked weary, a body too heavy looked careless, and somewhere between the two lay the form most desired, soft enough to promise comfort, yet toned enough to whisper of vitality and youth. The diets of these women were not the feasts of nobles, nor the rough meals of peasants. They existed in a curious space between. When favored by knights or noble patrons, they might be gifted with meats, sweetened pastries, or foreign fruits brought through trade, honey-glazed figs, roasted almonds, or warm bread scented with cinnamon. Yet they rarely consumed these luxuries without thought. Instead, they portioned carefully, nibbling just enough to maintain the glow of health without losing the delicacy of form. For every indulgence, there followed restraint, a day of fasting or meals reduced to broth and herbs to balance what the body carried. Fasting itself became both necessity and ritual. In a world where the church called for fast days, these women learned to use the practice as a hidden art of figure maintenance. A day spent with only bread and watered wine left their waists slimmer, their features sharper, their bodies lighter in movement. Some drank infusions of mint or sage, believing it calmed hunger, while others chewed fennel seeds to keep cravings at bay. Hunger, though sharp, was endured, for it was not only a test of discipline, but also a reminder. The curve of their hips, the grace of their arms, the strength of their posture all depended on this balance between restraint and indulgence. Movement, too, shaped them. Though the idea of exercise in the modern sense did not exist, these women found ways to keep their bodies supple and appealing. Dancing was one such practice, sometimes in secret, sometimes for a private audience, to sway with rhythm, to move the hips with subtle grace, to let the arms extend as if beckoning. This was not only performance, but also preservation. The body kept in dance was the body that could entice more easily, that could whisper of youth even as years passed. When alone, some practiced stretches, mimicking the gestures of dancers or acrobats glimpsed in town markets, bending and flexing to keep muscles lean. Bathing, though rare for most, became a hidden ritual for those who could manage it. The castles. Baths were often reserved for lords or for ceremonial cleansings, but a clever woman found her ways, a basin of warmed water, perfumed lightly with herbs, used to cleanse the skin, to soften the body, to keep the flesh smooth. To run hands along the curves of one's own body while washing was more than cleanliness. It was an inspection, a constant awareness of how the figure appeared, how it must be maintained, how it must be readied for the eyes of men who would study it more hungrily than they studied battle plans. Corsetry and lacing also played their role, though in forms far less rigid than later centuries would know. Women tied linen around their waists, drew laces across their bodices, tightened, just enough to suggest slenderness, yet not so much as to mar comfort. The illusion was subtle, a slightly narrower waist, a lifted curve, a smoother line beneath fabric. These small tricks could make the body appear more youthful, more tempting, more carefully shaped than it was in truth. And men, guided more by candlelight and desire than by cold analysis, rarely questioned the illusion. Yet the body was not only shape and flesh, it was posture, movement, presence. The prostitutes learned to walk with deliberate grace, to sit in ways that accentuated the figure, to lie upon furs or silks so that the lines of their bodies appeared languid, inviting. A tilt of the head, the arch of the back, the softness of hands folded in the lap. Each gesture was crafted to display the figure in its most alluring form. What might seem natural to an unknowing eye was, in truth, 1,000 tiny choices, 1,000 hidden rehearsals before mirrors of polished bronze. And beneath the surface of it all was the deeper truth. Their figures were not maintained only for beauty's sake. They were tools of survival, weapons in the quiet wars of seduction and secrecy. A lord who found himself entranced by the curve of a hip might loosen his tongue and speak of politics best kept silent. A knight, intoxicated by the sight of a figure lying in firelight, might return more eagerly, coin in hand, loyalty divided between duty and desire. The body was a map upon which men lost their way, and the women knew how to guide them into forgetting the harshness of their lives beyond those walls. Still, the burden was heavy. Hunger gnawed at them when fasting stretched too long. The sweetness of fruits gifted by admirers was sometimes denied, left untouched upon trays, their scent filling the chamber like temptation itself. The body demanded care, but care was costly. Some drank strange concoctions of vinegar or bitter herbs, believing they purged excess flesh. Others bound themselves too tightly, leaving bruises that only they saw, hidden beneath fabric. Their figures might win them desire, but the maintenance of it carried its own quiet suffering. And yet, when the moment came, when the knock at the chamber door signaled a knight or lord seeking solace, all of that suffering became invisible. The woman would rise with grace, her body poised in the perfection of preparation, her figure shaped by restraint, her movements softened by ritual. To the man who entered, she appeared effortless, natural, the very embodiment of temptation. He never saw the fasting, the aching muscles, the self-discipline hidden in silence. He saw only the allure, the figure of desire carefully crafted for his eyes alone. So the prostitutes of the castle carried their figures like secrets, as carefully as they carried their painted faces and perfumed hair. Each body was a story written, in silence, of restraint, of sacrifice, of endless attention to detail. And in the dim chambers of stone walls where men sought comfort and forgot the world outside, those figures became more than flesh. They became symbols of escape, of fantasy, of the fragile but powerful hold beauty had upon even the mightiest of men. And though the chronicles would never speak of them, though their names would fade into dust, their figures lingered in the memory of those who touched them, half-remembered curves, the softness of skin, the way a body shaped by discipline could still feel like unrestrained passion. The world outside might praise kings for victories and queens for alliances, but within those walls, in the secrecy of bedchambers, it was the figures of these women that swayed hearts, loosened tongues, and bent power in ways history dared not record. The stone walls of the castle kept many secrets, but none so perilous nor so intoxicating as the whispers of passion that stirred when the torches burned low. By day, the courtyards rang with the clang of steel, the orders of captains, the gossip of chambermaids. But when dusk slid into night, another kingdom awoke within those walls, a realm ruled not by law nor lineage, but by desire. For all their piety, their sermons, and their proclamations of order, medieval courts were teeming with secret romances, and among the most dangerous of these were those that bound the lives of prostitutes to knights, nobles, and sometimes even kings themselves. These women were no strangers to the marketplace of flesh. They knew the difference between coin-born pleasure and the look that lingered longer than gold could buy. Within candle-lit chambers, a glance could become a caress a kiss, and a kiss the undoing of a reputation. At first, it was the knights who came most often, Hardened men, sworn to honor and battle, whose armor gleamed by day but who stripped it away in secret at night. They came to the women not for transaction but for escape. Some came shaking with the wounds of war, desperate for gentler hands to trace the scars no one else dared to touch. Others came filled with boastful vigor, seeking to prove themselves in a more private conquest, one measured not in blood spilled but in breaths stolen. The prostitutes, though, were more than recipients of lust. They were keepers of confidence, the quiet confidants of men who could never unburden themselves to priests or kings. And sometimes, amid whispered admissions and trembling hands, lust shifted into something far more dangerous: love. The danger lay not in the acts themselves, those were commonplace, almost expected behind closed doors, but in the exclusivity of passion, the binding of two hearts where there should have been only flesh and coin. For when a knight gave his heart to a woman the church damned as sinful, he did more than risk his soul. He risked his oath, his allegiance, and sometimes even his life. One such tale, half shrouded by the smoke of rumor and the veils of lost parchments, tells of Sir Alaric, a knight of renown, whose name was etched upon banners for his victories in skirmishes along the border. By all accounts, he was loyal to his liege, a figure of discipline, adored by squires who longed to follow in his path. Yet when the sun fell behind the battlements, Sir Alaric was known to vanish, slipping not into the company of lords nor the training yards, but into the lower halls where the courtesans held their quarters. There he sought out Isolde, a woman whose beauty was not of the obvious, flaunted kind, but one that lingered in shadows, the curve of her lips that promised mischief, the gaze that seemed to undress the very soul of whoever met it. To her, Alaric came not with coin, but with poetry, scrawled hastily upon parchment, tucked beneath goblets of wine. To her, he spoke not as a knight, but as a man stripped of armor, both literal and figurative. Their meetings grew in intensity, in recklessness. What began as a secret hour became whole nights stolen from duty. Within Isolde's chamber, the knights' hands shook not with fear of enemy blades, but with the trembling vulnerability of forbidden love. Draped in the silks she kept hidden for her most demanding patrons, Isolde would press close, her perfume heavy with musk and roses, her whispers threading between declarations of passion and warnings of doom. For she knew, better than he, that such liaisons did not remain secret forever. The castle walls had ears, and tongues wagged faster than blades could swing, and indeed, their secret began to slip. Other knights noticed Alaric's absences, and nobles whispered of the coins that seemed always to find their way into Isolde's hands, though Alaric swore he never paid her. The line between mistress and lover blurred, and in blurring it became dangerous. Nobles could bed prostitutes, kings could use them, but to love them was an act of defiance, a rebellion against the order of things. Still, Alaric pressed on, blind to the gathering storm. Isolde was not alone in her entanglements. Many women within the castle walls cultivated such forbidden romances, some with stewards who managed the keep's daily affairs, slipping behind storerooms to press lips against one another's throats while the castle slumbered. Others with clerks who penned the king's decrees by day and spilled ink in letters of longing by night. The boldest among them even dared to court the affections of nobles themselves. These liaisons were never equal. A noble might hold a woman's life in his hands with a single word. Yet in the velvet shadows, roles could reverse. It was the woman who held the noble's secrets, the woman who could ruin him should she choose to breathe his name in the wrong ear. The most perilous of all were the romances with royals. Kings and princes, bound to marry for alliances, often found solace in beds they could not acknowledge. Here the prostitutes wielded power as dangerous as any blade. A single whispered secret could unmake treaties, ignite wars, topple thrones. And so, those who dared to step into such romances walked a knife's edge, balancing desire against doom. Some prospered, extracting jewels, estates, and influence from their lovers. Others vanished without trace, their names stricken from records, their bodies consigned to rivers and forests, as if they had never existed at all. The castles themselves became complicit in these romances. Behind tapestries, narrow stairways wound their way into hidden chambers. Beneath chapels lay crypts, where stone sarcophagi bore silent witness to bodies pressed together in the dark. Servants carried notes folded into loaves of bread, or concealed beneath platters of fruit, ferrying confessions of lust disguised as harmless exchanges. In such a world, every candle held a double flame, one of light and one of betrayal. Yet for all the danger, the allure was irresistible. The prostitutes were not blind to their precarious positions, but many found in these romances a taste of what was denied them: tenderness, recognition, a hand that lingered not for coin, but for longing. And the men, so often shackled by duty and expectation, found in the arms of these women a freedom they could claim nowhere else. That freedom, however, was fleeting. For the world outside the chamber always returned, and with it the cold reality of thrones and crowns, of reputations and ruin. There are whispers of Isolde's fate, though none can be confirmed. Some say she was discovered, her affair with Alaric revealed by jealous rivals, that she was dragged from her chamber, her silks torn, her protests drowned beneath the jeers of guards, that she was exiled, left to wander the roads, her name cursed as a temptress who had led a knight astray. Others claim she survived, that Alaric himself smuggled her from the castle, their love carrying them into obscurity where no record dared follow. And still others murmur that she was silenced by the nobles who feared what secrets she might have overheard. Whatever the truth, her story became legend among the other women, a cautionary tale of the line between desire and destruction. The forbidden romances of prostitutes in medieval castles were not aberrations. They were threads woven deeply into the fabric of courtly life. Behind the banners and the battles, behind the piety and the pomp, lay a world of passion that could not be tamed. These women, condemned in public as sinners, in private wielded power through the hearts they captured. And while their names may be absent from the official chronicles, their presence lingers in the shadows of history, where lust and love conspired to shape destinies no king could fully control. The night within the castle stretched long, filled with sighs and oaths, with hands clutching at sheets and lips seeking solace. The torches burned low, casting flickering light on stone walls that had seen centuries of secrets, and in that fragile space between silence and scandal, the forbidden romances of the women who lived in shadows left a mark as indelible as any battle, as transformative as any decree. For while kings ruled with crowns and knights with steel, it was in these whispered trysts that the true vulnerabilities of power were laid bare. The stone walls of the medieval castle were thick, built to withstand siege and storm, but no wall was thick enough to keep out the sighs and murmurs of what happened behind the velvet curtains of the bedchambers. By day, the castle was a place of order. Banners hung, armor gleamed, prayers echoed in chapels, and courtyards rang with steel. But by night, another world stirred awake. A softer world, one woven not with swords and shields, but with silks, oils, and the unspoken games of flesh and desire. The prostitutes of the castle knew this world better than anyone. They were its queens, its dancers, its weavers of fantasies. And in their chambers, lit by candle and perfumed by burning resin, men of every rank revealed what they dared not confess in daylight. They came armored in pride, in titles, in faith, but the moment the doors shut, their masks slipped. What they wanted most was not always what the church permitted, nor what society deemed proper. In bed, Men longed to taste forbidden fruit, and women learned to bend and twist their arts to every appetite. For some, the game was one of power. A knight might spend his day bowing to his lord, obeying commands without question, but in bed he wanted to be the master. He wanted a woman on her knees whispering his greatness, his manhood, his imagined invincibility. He wanted her to beg for him as peasants begged for bread. The prostitutes learned to give this with ease, for the illusion of power was cheaper than gold and more intoxicating than wine. With a soft moan and a lowered gaze, they could turn even the weakest man into a conqueror in his own mind. But others sought the opposite. Lords who carried the weight of armies, who were bowed to by hundreds, longed to surrender in secret. They wanted to be commanded, punished even, by women who knew how to wield softness as a weapon. These men trembled not at the clash of swords, but at the touch of leather against skin, at the teasing voice of a woman telling them they were unworthy, at the delicious sting of being denied. And so, the prostitutes became actresses, slipping into roles of cruel mistresses, demanding queens, or playful tormentors. The stronger the man in daylight, the more he sometimes craved to be undone by night. There were games of innocence, too, fantasies of maidens untouched, trembling brides on their wedding night. A man might pay a fortune to be guided through, a script where the woman feigned reluctance, blushing, resisting, until finally melting in his arms. The irony was not lost on the women. They who had seen every sin, every lust, every kink imaginable, could play the part of virgins more convincingly than any cloistered maiden. Their experience gave them the tools to mimic inexperience, and men, blinded by their own desire, never saw the performance for what it was. Then there were the games of indulgence. Men wanted feasts of the body as they had feasts in the hall. Abundance, variety, excess. They wanted not one woman, but two, sometimes three, their limbs entwined like serpents around him, their mouths and hands working in harmony. In such games, the chamber became a stage of tangled sheets, gasps, and laughter. The women, though, sometimes rivals in daylight, learned to move together as though rehearsed, for a man willing to pay for such pleasures was always worth the effort. Music, too, was part of the bedchamber. A lute strummed softly in the corner, a flute's sigh, or even the rhythmic beat of a drum could heighten the senses. Some prostitutes trained themselves to sing in low, sultry tones, humming against the skin of their lovers, turning a simple touch into a symphony. Candles were arranged to cast shadows just so, painting the curves of their bodies in gold and crimson light. Scented oils slicked over skin until touch became gliding, slippery, endless. Every sense was drawn into the game: sight, sound, taste, smell, touch, until the man believed himself lost in a world outside time, a world where only pleasure mattered. There were darker games, too, those spoken only in whispers. Some men came with hungers that bordered on cruelty. They wanted to bind, to mark, to push bodies past their limits. These were the most dangerous clients, for a wrong move could leave a woman broken. Yet even here, many prostitutes learned ways to bend danger into performance. They used silk cords instead of rope, wax from candles that burned warm but not searing, the art of feigned pain mixed with real pleasure. They made cruelty an illusion, a performance that left the man sated but the woman safe. It was a dance upon a blade's edge, and only the most skilled dared perform it, and always there was romance. For though gold bought bodies, hearts could sometimes slip unguarded into the games. A knight who kissed with trembling devotion, who whispered promises as though each word were a prayer, could make even the most hardened woman pause. A lord who held her as though she were fragile glass might awaken long-forgotten tenderness. These games of romance were the most dangerous of all, for once love entered the chamber. The line between client and companion blurred. More than one prostitute found herself caught in a web of longing, unable to separate play from truth. And more than one man lost his reason, convinced he had found in her arms not a courtesan, but a soulmate. The art of seduction was endless in its variety. Some women painted their bodies with honey, inviting their lovers to taste them as though feasting upon ambrosia. Others used ice from the castle cellars, shocking the skin with its sting, only to warm it again with lips and breath. There were women who knew how to ride a man as though they were warriors on a battlefield, fierce and unrelenting, and others who moved with such slow grace that time itself seemed to stretch. Each man was different, each hunger unique, and the women became mirrors, reflecting back the secret desires they alone dared to voice. But the games were not only for men. The women played their own games, too. They tested their clients' weaknesses, learning who could be coaxed into paying double, who could be softened into revealing secrets, who could be teased until his pride cracked. Pleasure was not just an act. It was strategy. Every gasp, every sigh, every shiver was a step in the game. And while the men thought themselves players, often it was the women who truly held the board. Yet the games were not without cost. The body could tire, the spirit could grow weary. Night after night, performance after performance, the women gave pieces of themselves away. They painted their lips, perfumed their skin, laced their corsets tight, and entered the chambers like queens. But behind the doors, when the games ended and the men slept, they were often left staring at ceilings, wondering if they had lost themselves in the illusions they wove. The laughter, the moans, the whispered words, all of it could blur until truth itself became uncertain. Still, the bedchamber games endured, for desire was endless, and men would always pay. And in that endlessness, the prostitutes found a strange power. Though they were scorned in daylight, though priests condemned them and ladies sneered, in those locked chambers they ruled. Kings laid aside crowns, knights cast down swords, priests abandoned prayers, and all bent beneath the sway of women who knew the oldest art in the world, the art of desire. The castle was a fortress of stone, but its true heart beat in the dark, in chambers perfumed and candlelit, where games of lust, love, power, and surrender played out endlessly. And though history would never record their names, the women who ruled those rooms shaped destinies as surely as any king. The castle was a world of stone and iron, of echoing footsteps along drafty corridors and the clang of armored men at arms. Yet within that hard shell of power there existed a softer kingdom, one spun from fabrics, stitched with longing, perfumed with temptation. In this hidden realm, women ruled not with swords, but with silk. And if the men of the court believed themselves to be masters, they had only to see the loosening of a corset, the glimpse of a garter beneath a gown, to be reminded where power truly lay. Clothing in the medieval world was more than protection, more than ornament. It was theater. Every fabric whispered a story, every color carried a weight of meaning, every fold could be arranged to reveal or conceal, to ignite or smother a man's imagination. The prostitutes who walked the shadowed galleries of castles knew this better than any noble lady. They understood that desire began not with a touch, but with a look, with the way silk clung to a thigh, the way velvet shimmered in candlelight, the way a ribbon could slip undone with the tug of a finger. By day, they dressed, modestly enough to avoid scandal. Their gowns might be simple wool, their heads covered with hoods or veils. But when night came, when the guards grew drowsy at their posts and the halls echoed with the soft scurry of rats, another transformation began. In hidden chambers, trunks were unlocked, and out spilled the weapons of their trade, silks from the east, gauze from the Levant, linens dyed crimson, emerald, sapphire. Each garment was chosen with care, each stitch intended to ensnare the eyes of the men who would pay dearly to undo them. The corset was perhaps their greatest instrument. Bound tight, it sculpted a woman's form into the hourglass that poets praised and artists carved into stone. But its true power lay not in what it revealed, but in what it promised. A man watching as laces were slowly loosened, as taut fabric, surrendered inch by inch, was undone long before he ever reached the skin beneath. The game of unbinding was as potent as any kiss, for each tug of the cord was a drumbeat of anticipation, each sigh of release a prelude to what was to come. Hidden garters carried their own secrets. A knight might think himself bold when he slipped, a hand beneath a hem, only to find a ribbon, a strap, a delicate band that clung to flesh in ways he had never imagined. These small, intimate garments, rare, expensive, and often smuggled through trade routes, were as forbidden as any sin. The church condemned them as vanity, the nobles dismissed them as scandalous, but men could not resist the thrill of touching what was meant to remain hidden, and the women knew it. They would let a glimpse flash as they crossed a chamber, a stocking sliding just enough to reveal the clasp, leaving their client hungry, restless, aching for more. Even the choice of color mattered. Crimson for passion, gold for wealth, black for mystery. Some women wrapped themselves in white, playing at innocence, letting their clients believe they were defiling purity itself. Others preferred deep green, the color of fertility, of lush gardens, of wild temptation. Silk could glimmer like water, velvet could swallow light like shadow, and the clever courtesan knew how to dress for the fantasy she wished to sell. Perfume was woven into the fabric, too. Gowns might be scented with rosewater, with musk, with amber carried from distant caravans. A man leaning close to kiss a breast found himself drowning not only in flesh but in fragrance, a spell that lingered long after he left the chamber. He might wake the next morning with the scent still on his hands, on his lips, haunting him like a ghost. Desire was not just a matter of the body, it was memory, and perfume ensured that no man forgot. The prostitutes became masters of layering, too. They understood that to reveal everything at once was to squander the game. Instead, they draped themselves in veils, in gauzy fabrics so sheer they concealed nothing and yet made the eye crave more. A veil across the face transformed a woman into a mystery, a challenge, a forbidden jewel. A sheer chemise clinging to damp skin could reveal the shape of every curve without granting a single touch. Men often spoke of these nights not as if they had spent time with women, but with visions, illusions made flesh. And what of the games within the undressing? A woman might allow a man to untie each ribbon himself, savoring his fumbling, his impatience, until the frustration burned hotter than lust itself. Or she might deny him entirely, shedding her garments piece by piece with a dancer's grace, leaving him powerless, captive to the rhythm of her unveiling. Clothing was both barrier and promise, both shield and invitation. To remove it was not merely to disrobe, but to enact a ritual older than language. There were tales whispered of certain courtesans who possessed garments enchanted with memory. A red gown that clung like flame, so that every man who saw it dreamed of fire. A white chemise that glowed in candlelight, so that men swore its wearer was an angel fallen to earth. Whether these tales were true or not mattered little. In the world of silk and seduction, belief was everything. If a man believed a gown made him mad with desire, then it did. If he believed a woman's veil made her untouchable, then he would pay any sum for the privilege of lifting it. And still, there was the sound, the soft hiss of silk drawn over skin, the whisper of fabric slipping to the floor, the crackle of stiff brocade yielding at last. These sounds stirred men as much as sight. In the silence of a locked chamber, the fall of a gown was thunder, the rustle of skirts was music, the thud of shoes discarded was the opening note of a symphony. A woman undressing was not a solitary act. It was a performance, and her body was both stage and player. Even the simplest adornments became part of the game. A pearl sewn into a bodice, a golden clasp at the hip, a silver chain that draped across the shoulders. Each was a promise, each a lure. Men remembered not only the softness of skin, but the way light caught on jewels, the way metal warmed against flesh. They spoke of those details long after, as though the ornaments themselves had bewitched them. For the prostitutes, clothing was survival as much as art. A gown could be armor, protecting them with the illusion of grandeur. A veil could conceal, giving them anonymity when scandal threatened. A corset could hold them upright when exhaustion weighed them down. And when all else failed, silk could soothe, wrapping them in softness after nights of performance, letting them feel, if only for a moment, like women rather than illusions. But always, the fabric carried secrets. It held the heat of bodies, the scent of sweat and perfume, the stains of passion. A gown worn to one man's bedchamber might carry into another the memory of sighs and moans. Some courtesans even left threads behind deliberately, a ribbon tied, around a bedpost, a scrap of silk beneath a pillow. These tokens haunted men, driving them to return, to pay again, to chase the memory they could never quite hold. In the end, silk was more than fabric. It was a language. It spoke in whispers, where words dared not go. It promised, it denied, it seduced, it enslaved. And though the stone walls of the castle would one day crumble, though the names of kings and lords would fade, the memory of silk, the way it clung, the way it slipped, the way it concealed and revealed, would endure in the secret histories of those who knew its power. For the women, silk was both freedom and chain. It made them unforgettable, yes, but it also trapped them in the endless performance of desire. They were queens of shadow, crowned not in gold, but in velvet, robed not in ermine, but in satin, and their throne was the bed, their scepter, the veil. Their legacy, a trail of silk slipping silently across the cold stone floors of the castle, one garment at a time. The castle was never silent. No matter how thick the walls, no matter how many guards patrolled the grounds, or how heavily the gates were barred against the world outside. At night, when the torches dimmed and the great hearths dwindled to embers, whispers came alive. They slipped like silk through corridors, clung to stairwells like mist, and coiled in the ears of those who lingered too long in shadows. In this world, secrets had weight. They could crown a king or topple him. They could make a lowly servant the most feared person in a court, or leave a duchess trembling in fear of disgrace. And no voices were sharper, no ears more attuned than those of the women who lived not in the light of day, but in the veiled half-life of the castle's hidden pleasures. The prostitutes of the castle knew better than anyone how much power whispers held. They were closer to men in their moments of weakness than wives ever dared to be, closer to lords and knights when their pride was lowered by desire. They knew the trembling sighs of men who feared God but feared loneliness more. They knew the softness in a prince who roared like a lion in the hall but whimpered in bed. They knew which lady of the court had taken a lover, which knight had debts he could not pay, which priest had tasted wine forbidden to him. And in their chambers, behind closed doors, words spilled like wine across lips, too eager or too tired to hold them back. The women learned quickly that beauty could open doors, but knowledge could keep them open. A lord's gold might pay for their perfume and silks, but his whispered confession while drunk with lust might be worth far more. A passing word about a duel planned in secret, about a marriage alliance teetering on ruin, about a chamberlain's theft of silver coins, was a treasure no less than a jewel hidden in a chest. The prostitutes remembered every detail. They collected stories like rosary beads, stringing them together until the castle itself was an open book in their minds. Whispers spread differently in their mouths. A noble lady might murmur to her confidant, with trembling restraint, hoping her words never left the chamber. A knight might boast too loudly in the stables, only to curse himself later when rumor found him out. But the women of pleasure carried whispers like perfume, faint, subtle, lingering on the skin of those they brushed against. A smile offered in the hall, a playful tease by the fountain, and suddenly a man's secret burned in everyone's thoughts, without anyone knowing how it escaped. There was a rhythm to it, almost like music. The laundress, hanging linens in the courtyard, would notice a stain on the sheets too large to be explained by spilled wine. She would tell the cook, who would smirk knowingly and pass it along with a loaf of bread. The stable boy would overhear. The cook, and when he came to warm his hands by the fire of the prostitute's chamber, he would spill it for a kiss or a laugh. And by the time dawn came, the entire castle seemed to hum with knowledge of a scandal. Who had crept into whose bed, who had been caught at confession, who had failed to satisfy his mistress. But gossip in a castle was never harmless. The wrong word in the wrong ear could end a life. A knight accused of bedding his lord's wife could be hanged by noon. A woman accused of seducing a priest could be beaten through the streets as a warning. And still the whispers never stopped. They were as irresistible as hunger, as inevitable as desire. The prostitutes walked a dangerous line, for they were both victims and masters of gossip. Their reputations could be shattered in an instant if rumors painted them too ambitious, too conniving. Yet with careful hands, they also wielded those same rumors as weapons. A rival could be ruined with a well-timed hint, a dangerous affair hidden by diverting attention elsewhere. Some women became experts at it, weaving webs so intricate that even lords bowed their heads in fear of what might be known about them. There was Elaine, a courtesan whose beauty was matched only by her cunning tongue. She never lied outright. Lies could be unmasked, but she perfected the art of suggestion. A glance at a knight as she spoke of betrayal, a raised brow when a lady's virtue was praised, and the seed was planted. Before long, others watered it with their own suspicions until the rumor grew wild and tangled. Elaine thrived on it, rising higher in the favor of nobles who wanted her insight into the unseen threads of power. She whispered truths when it suited, her falsehoods when it suited her more, and behind every word she carefully hid her own desires. Then there was Mariette, less cunning, more impulsive. Her tongue was quick when her temper flared, and more than once her loose words placed her in danger. She spoke once of a duke's habit of dressing in his dead wife's gowns, a secret told to her in drunken grief. When the word spread, the duke himself dragged her by the hair into the hall and demanded her execution. It was only the intercession of a knight, who himself had been tangled in Mariette's bed, that spared her life. But the lesson lingered. Whispers could kill as swiftly as a sword. For the men, too, the whispers carried both thrill and terror. To be desired by one of these women was flattering. To be mocked by them in hushed voices was ruin. A knight might ride bravely into battle, yet dread the soft laughter of women echoing behind him, wondering if his failures in bed were now common knowledge. Nobles wore their pride like armor. But all armor has cracks, and in those cracks the women pressed with laughter, sighs, and quiet words that could bring even the most arrogant man to his knees. The church thundered against it, calling gossip a sin as black as lust itself. Priests warned that tongues sharper than blades would burn in hellfire, yet even the priests were not immune. Many confessions heard in shadowed chapels were repeated, indirectly, carefully, but repeated all the same, through the lips of the women who entertained them. A priest might seek absolution for his temptations, only to find himself the subject of whispers the next day. And when the prostitutes giggled behind closed doors about the holy men who came to them cloaked in shame, they revealed the hypocrisy of those who judged them. Sometimes gossip became romance itself. A knight who had never touched a woman might imagine he was adored by one simply because he heard whispers of her supposed longing for him. A lady might believe herself pursued, her vanity stoked by false words carried from chamber to chamber. And when truth and rumor blurred, the line between desire and deception vanished. Many romances began not in truth, but in whispers. Words spun from longing, fear, or ambition, drifting through the castle until two people believed themselves, bound by love. But just as often, whispers destroyed what they created. A woman accused of seducing the wrong man might be banished, her body cast out into the cold night. A knight whose affair was revealed might find himself stripped of rank, his lands seized, his honor destroyed. And always, in the background, the prostitutes walked silently, their heads bowed, their eyes sharp, listening, gathering every word. Whispers were not always cruel. Sometimes they carried kindness, soft words of comfort that could not be spoken aloud. A prostitute beaten by a cruel master might hear another woman whisper, "You are not alone." A knight's last words to his lover before battle might be carried by a servant's tongue when he could not return himself. Secrets of love and loyalty, too, flowed through those halls, hidden beneath layers of scandal and lust. Yet even these tender whispers were dangerous, for in the castle, nothing remained untouched. Every kindness could be twisted, every love exposed. The women learned to guard their hearts as fiercely as their secrets, for to trust too much was to invite ruin. And so the castle at night remained alive with its whispers. Behind every curtain, in every alcove, words fluttered like moths. The prostitutes, beautiful and cunning, were both its victims and its queens. They carried stories in their eyes, on their lips, in the sway of their hips as they walked the stone halls. They knew the truth, that the castle itself was built not only on stone, but on secrets. And secrets, once loosed into the air, could never truly be silenced. Theirs was a life where a moan of pleasure and a whispered word might weigh the same as a sword in deciding a man's fate. Where beauty was fleeting, but the memory of a scandal lasted generations. Where whispers in the dark shaped not just reputations, but destinies. And as the firelight flickered against the high walls, as the echoes of laughter and sighs filled, the chambers, the women of the castle leaned into the silence, their ears always sharp, their lips always ready. For in a world where pleasure was bought and sold, the most valuable currency was not flesh, but whispers. The knight had removed his armor not in the hall of kings, not in the chapel where he had sworn oaths, but in a chamber hidden from prying eyes, where the candles burned low and the air smelled of spiced wine, sweat, and perfume. His hands, once steady on the hilt of a sword, trembled as they traced the lace edge of a gown that had been slipped halfway down pale shoulders. He had faced the clangor of steel, the rush of arrows, the screams of dying men. But it was here, in this chamber, of silk and shadows, that he knew true fear. For battle was fleeting, but this was dangerous in a way no battlefield could ever rival. The women who took knights into their arms knew the weight of the confessions whispered in their beds. They were not mere vessels for release, but mirrors where men laid down their pride, their secrets, their yearning hearts. A knight might swear to his lord in daylight, but by night, with his armor gone, he swore again, to the curve of a breast, to the warmth of a thigh, to the lips that swallowed the guilt he dared not speak. Elsewhere, they called them confessions because in the trembling hour when passion broke him open, he could not help but admit what he could never say to priest or king. There was Sir Aldrich, hardened by years of campaign, who was said to have burned villages. Without remorse, a man whose armor was stained with smoke and blood. Yet in the arms of a woman whose laughter rang like chimes in the dark, he wept like a boy. She had not mocked him. Instead, she cradled his head against her chest and ran her fingers through his hair, letting him murmur of the faces he still saw when he closed his eyes. He confessed not only sins of lust, but sins of war, and for him, the gentleness of her hand was absolution. When he finally took her, it was not with conquest, but with trembling gratitude, as if he feared she might vanish with dawn. Another night, Sir Roderick came more boldly. He was famed for his beauty, the kind of man poets compared to carved marble, but the bedchamber revealed a truth no bard would sing. He craved not conquest, but surrender. He begged the courtesan to bind his wrists with silk, to take from him the power he wore like second skin on the field. She obliged with a smile, knowing well that knights often wore masks so heavy they crushed their souls. In giving him the gift of yielding, she freed him. When he moaned beneath her, confessing in gasps how weary he was of being worshipped, she gave him not mockery, but tenderness. And so he returned, again and again, not for the pleasures of flesh alone, but for the chance to feel human. Not every confession was gentle. Sir Emmerich, broad-shouldered and scarred, demanded roughness, hungering for the sharp scrape of nails and the sting of teeth. He came to the courtesan with a fever in his eyes, a desperation born of years holding himself upright in the brutal discipline of the king's guard. He confessed, panting between thrusts, that the battlefield was the only place he felt alive, until now. In her arms, in her bites and her clawing grasp, he found another battlefield, one where he could lose and still survive. She gave him bruises that he wore proudly beneath his armor, unseen medals of a different kind of war. But perhaps the most dangerous confessions came not from lust, but from love. A knight swearing fealty in public might whisper forbidden vows in the dark, promises that could cost him his life. One such tale lingered in hushed corridors of Lady Isabeau, a courtesan of unrivaled beauty who drew into her bed Sir Tristan, loyal retainer to the king himself. At first it was hunger, the quick, desperate coupling of man and woman whose veins burned too hot to resist. But lust softened, deepened, turned into something perilous. Soon he no longer spoke only of her body, but of her smile, of her eyes that haunted him beneath his helm. He confessed that in the clash of steel, when his comrades fell screaming, it was her face that kept him alive. They say he wrote her letters by candlelight, verses smuggled in beneath cups of wine, and that she hid them in the folds of her silks, reading them by night with trembling fingers. Their affair grew reckless. He came not only in secret, but lingered too long, kissed her in places where prying eyes might see. And when rumors reached the ears of jealous rivals, danger stalked them both. It is said Tristan died not on the battlefield, but beneath the silent hand of assassins sent by one who envied his daring. Lady Isabeau wept as though she were a widow, though no church would name her one, and yet for all the risk she never repented. She whispered his name into the night until her last breath, carrying his confession as her own. The women of the silken chambers knew how to listen. Some knights confessed their cruelties, how they had broken peasants under heel, how they had stolen daughters in the night. Others spoke of wounds deeper than flesh, betrayals by lords, brothers lost to war, the gnawing fear that when history was sung, their names would be forgotten. In the press of sweat and sheets, these fears were laid bare, not to be judged, but to be held. And when the climax came, it was not always just the release of body, but the release of burdens chained too long to the soul. One woman, known only as the Red Lady, kept her own kind of confessional. She told no priest, made no record, but her memory held the secrets of dozens of men. She said little, but her eyes never wavered, and men poured themselves out before her as though she were a shrine. Some left laughing, Some left silent, and some never returned, fearing the truth of what they had admitted in her arms. Yet she remained, a keeper of oaths whispered in sweat and shadows, more dangerous than any sword, because she knew what knights dared not tell even their kings. Yet not all confessions ended with sweetness. There were moments when a knight's yearning turned to obsession, when love soured into possession. Some demanded exclusivity, forgetting that the woman they adored had duties beyond them. Jealousy burned like wildfire. A knight who had slaughtered enemies without hesitation might fall into madness at the thought of another man's lips on the same mouth that had kissed him. Some duels began not on fields of honor, but outside hidden doors, where steel flashed, for the prize of a woman who never asked to be fought over. And when blood spilled on cobblestones, she bore the blame in whispers, though she had only given comfort to lonely men. But even in such dangers, the confessions remained irresistible, for knights lived on the edge of death, their lives a gamble, of steel and loyalty. In the bedchamber, they sought not only pleasure but meaning, proof that they were still human, still capable of more than bloodshed. And the women, wise in ways no priest could fathom, gave them that absolution. With every sigh, every kiss, every whispered vow in the dark, they bound the confessions of knights into the secret tapestry of history, unseen but no less powerful than the chronicles written by scribes. For long after battles were forgotten, after banners rotted and castles crumbled, it was the memory of a knight's trembling words in a woman's ear that lingered. Love, lust, fear, and longing, all confessed in silken shadows where no armor could shield them and no sword could silence them. The torches flickered in the narrow corridors of the castle, casting shadows that seemed to stretch longer than the walls themselves, as though the stones had absorbed centuries of whispered sins. For every sigh behind closed doors, there came a consequence waiting in the daylight, for passion was never truly free in those medieval halls. Pleasure carried a price, and those who lived by beauty and desire often paid it with coin, reputation, or blood. In the hushed chambers where knights and prostitutes entwined, the scent of perfume and sweat still clung to linens long after the lovers had gone. But with each tryst came the ever-tightening grip of risk. A noble's jealous wife might notice his sudden absence from the high table. A steward might overhear the wrong phrase whispered as he carried trays of wine. Servants, often unseen, became the sharpest blades of betrayal, their gossip worth more than gold to rivals and clergy alike. To indulge in forbidden romance was to balance always on the edge of discovery. The dangers were not equal. A knight caught in the bed of a prostitute might suffer the sting of ridicule, a loss of honor, perhaps demotion, but he would live. For the woman, the punishment, could be ruinous. She was the temptress, the corrupter, the harlot who dared to reach above her station. A single whispered accusation could end her livelihood, exile her from the castle, or see her thrown into the dungeon, to rot. Many men claimed their passions were stolen by these women's charms, but the women themselves bore the lash of judgment. There are stories of jealousies that turned love into peril. Isolde, whose beauty had captured the heart of Sir Alaric, was not alone in drawing dangerous affection. Another woman, Brienne, envied the jewels Alaric gifted his lover, and whispered to the wife of a steward that Isolde's bed was not empty when duty called. In that moment, passion became poison, and the walls themselves seemed to lean in to listen. Soon enough, rumors reached the ears of those who could not ignore them. It was not Isolde's sighs that condemned her, but Brienne's envy sharpened into words. The price of pleasure was often paid not in the act itself, but in the betrayal of others who walked the same perilous path. And then there was the church. Priests spoke with fiery tongues against the sins of the flesh, declaring that prostitutes lured men from God's light. Yet even these men, cloaked in vestments, sometimes sought the warmth of those very same women under the cover of night. Hypocrisy flourished within cloisters and castles alike. Still, when exposed, it was not the priest who suffered most. It was the woman accused of tempting him from his vows. The punishments ranged from public penance, where women were forced to stand barefooted before jeering crowds, to the searing humiliation of being marked, their garments stripped, their hair shorn away to brand them as sinners. But punishment could be far crueler still. A noblewoman who discovered her husband's secret affair might not bring her grievance to the court, but to her maid with whispered orders. In the shadows, knives did the work that laws could not. Prostitutes were found with throats cut, their beauty marred forever, their secrets silenced. Each body was a warning. The castle was a place of pleasure, but also a place where pleasure's price was often death. Yet for all the risks, the romances did not cease. Women sought survival as much as passion, and in those entanglements sometimes lay protection. A knight might shield his lover from punishment with the threat of his sword. A noble might grant estates, clothing, or coin that elevated a woman. Beyond the reach of rivals, still such shields were fragile. If the knight fell in battle, if the noble turned his favor elsewhere, the woman was left exposed, her secrets ripe for those who wished her downfall. Whispers tell of Mariette, whose beauty entranced a prince himself. She was lavished with gowns of velvet, jewels set in gold, perfumes from distant lands. But when the prince's betrothal was announced, her fate shifted. No longer the hidden jewel of the castle, she became a liability. His bride-to-be demanded her removal, and Mariette was accused of witchcraft, of binding the prince's heart through charms and potions. No truth mattered in the face of politics. She was seized, her chamber torn apart in search of evidence, and though none was found, the accusation alone sealed her fate. Some say she was burned in the courtyard, her screams rising with the flames. Others whisper she was smuggled out by loyal friends, vanishing into the forests beyond the walls. Whichever the truth, her story echoed through the castle long after, a warning to every woman who dared to love where she was forbidden. Jealousy was the unseen plague of the castle. It brewed not only among women, but among men whose pride was wounded when affection shifted. A knight who discovered his lover's eyes wandering to another might not confront her, but instead his rival. Challenges were whispered, daggers drawn in courtyards, blood spilled not for kings or causes, but for the fleeting embrace of a woman. Many such duels were covered in the veil of honor, but those who looked closely knew the truth, that it was lust, not loyalty, which had demanded the clash of steel. And again, it was the women who bore the heavier price. If one man fell, she was accused of driving him to folly, a siren whose song lured knights to their deaths. The punishments grew, more creative with power. Some women were forced into exile, sent beyond the castle gates with nothing but rags to cover their bodies. Others were locked away, confined to convents where their days were spent in prayer and silence, their beauty wasted behind walls colder than any dungeon. A few were marked in ways that could not be undone, branded with hot irons, so that all who looked upon them knew they had once transgressed. In such marks, the price of pleasure was made eternal, burned into flesh long after the romance that caused it was forgotten. And yet, despite the cruelty, despite the risk, despite the certainty of ruin, desire endured. The castle was not a place where passions could be extinguished. It was a furnace that burned hotter for every attempt to douse it. The women knew this truth well. They accepted the price, calculating with careful glances and hidden smiles which risks were worth the reward. Some sought stability, others sought protection, and a few sought love itself, reckless and consuming, no matter the cost. The air of the castle seemed forever charged with this tension. The sense that behind every heavy door lay a secret, that beneath every banquet's laughter whispered the danger of discovery. And as long as there were men bound by duty and women bound by survival, there would be trysts to ignite scandal and punishments to smother them. Thus, the price of pleasure was never merely the act of love, but the weight of the world that pressed against it. For within those medieval walls, beauty and desire were treasures as dangerous as any crown, and those who dared to wield them often found that passion could lift them to silken heights or cast them into the deepest abyss. The bed was still warm with the violence of passion when the first whispers began. That was always the way of it. Men and women spent themselves in the furious storm of desire, their bodies slick with sweat and their mouths raw with kisses, and when the storm passed, when the limbs tangled more loosely and the frantic breathing softened into sighs, the chamber filled with words. Not words meant for the council chamber or the chapel, not words shaped by duty or oaths, but words heavy with the weight of secrets that should never leave a throat. And yet they poured out again and again, for lust had the power to loosen, more than just clothing. There was something about the press of silk sheets, the flicker of candles guttering low, the intimacy of skin on skin that unshackled tongues. A nobleman who in daylight strutted through the halls in gleaming robes, every syllable measured and guarded, found himself unable to stop speaking once he lay bare, his head pillowed on a courtesan's breast, for in that darkness he believed himself safe. He believed the woman beside him, whether courtesan, mistress, or secret bride, was a vault where words could vanish. He was wrong, and he was right, for the women kept those secrets, but the secrets themselves never died. They lingered, heavy as incense, staining the very air of the chamber. A count, trembling still from the frenzy of release, confessed that he had stolen from the king's treasury, melting coin to fund his private wars. A duke, with his lips still, wet from kissing thighs, whispered of the pact he had sworn with an enemy realm, promising support should rebellion rise. A queen's cousin, naked in the arms of the woman who had seen him stripped of dignity, admitted that he had poisoned his brother to secure his inheritance. These were not boasts spoken in drunken halls. They were truths offered because lust had made them pliable, weak, and desperate to be heard. One woman, called Isolde of the Vale, famed for her eyes like storm clouds, listened more than she spoke. Men who lay with her often woke dazed, not remembering half the things they had confessed. They told her of hidden letters sealed with wax, of lovers waiting in distant castles, of bastard children whose existence would shame entire dynasties. One night, mad with desire, told her in gasps that the king's most trusted adviser had plotted with foreign priests to overthrow the crown. Another noble revealed that he had bribed bishops with gold and flesh to annul marriages, binding alliances no law of God had sanctioned. Isolde listened, smiled, and tucked each truth away. It was said that she held in her mind enough poison to kill kingdoms, but secrets were not always spoken in whispers of treachery. Some were softer, no less dangerous for their tenderness. Lady of rank, her gown fallen open, confessed to her lover that she no longer loved her lord husband, that she dreamed instead of fleeing to a cloister where vows would bind her heart in peace. A prince, his face buried against the perfumed shoulder of his mistress, confessed he feared the crown, that he longed for anonymity, for the simple life of a soldier. He kissed her again and again, as though each press of lips could keep the truth locked between them. But the truth, once spoken in the hush of silk and sweat, had a life of its own. There were women who wove these secrets into their power. For what was a courtesan, if not a keeper of kingdoms in the folds of her sheets? She might lie with a man in the dark, stroke his chest until his words spilled like spilled wine, and by morning she knew more than any spy or priest. Some say wars were begun not in council chambers, but in bedrooms, because a noble woman whispered, too loudly of her lover's ambitions, or because a courtesan repeated what she had been told in the haze of passion. Secrets carried in sweat and kisses had toppled towers and rewritten oaths sworn in marble halls. One tale tells of a baron who lay with a woman of no title, only beauty. In the delirium of release, he confessed to her the time and place of a coming rebellion, swearing her to silence even as his hand trembled along her thigh. She promised with a smile, but the next night the secret was spoken again, this time in another chamber, to another man with coin in his hand. By dawn, the king's guard was waiting. The rebellion was crushed before it began. The baron was hanged. His mistress vanished, and still the castle halls whispered of how a moment of weakness between sweat-slick sheets had undone him. Another confession, softer, came from a queen herself. She lay with a knight whose lips had pressed her crown as reverently as her flesh, and in the trembling hours before dawn, she admitted that the heir in her womb was not her husband's. The knight kissed her tears away, swore he would protect her secret with his life. Yet he trembled too, for he knew what ruin might follow. And still, when dawn came, he put on his armor, carrying the burden of her pillow talk like a hidden wound. History never wrote his name, but the whispers of that queen's bedchamber lived far longer than his victories on the field. The danger of pillow talk was not just in what was said, but in how it was remembered, in darkness, with passion still. Humming in the body, a man might think his words vanished into the air, but the woman beside him remembered. She remembered the shift in his voice, the quickening of his breath, the tremor of his hand. She could recall not only what he confessed, but how much he meant it. And she carried it, not in books or letters, but in her blood and bones, ready to be summoned when the moment came. Some became experts in coaxing secrets from their lovers. A kiss followed by a question, a hand sliding lower while asking a name. A soft laugh when a man grew hesitant, urging him to go on. By the time climax left him weak and pliant, his lips could not resist the spill of truth. The women who mastered this art became more dangerous than any assassin. For an assassin killed a man. A courtesan could kill his honor, his alliances, his very dynasty. It was not always betrayal. Some women kept the secrets they were told, never speaking them aloud. They became the silent confessors of their age, offering absolution with their bodies instead of words. Men left lighter than they had entered, convinced their burdens had been cast into the dark. But the women remembered, and sometimes remembering was enough to shift the course of fate. A single whispered phrase could echo across years. A prince confessing love for a woman not his bride. A lord admitting he plotted treason with foreign gold. A bishop sighing of sins hidden beneath his robes. Each truth spoken in the sanctuary of the bed carried farther than the speaker ever intended. For darkness may cradle secrets, but it never destroys them. And so the chambers where these lovers lay became more than places of lust. They were courts of a different kind, where the judge was the one who listened, and the verdict was written not in parchment, but in memory. The secrets shared in darkness shaped destinies, dethroned kings, lifted courtesans to power, and damned men to nooses. When the candles guttered out and dawn crept in, the lovers might rise, dressing themselves once more in dignity and silence. But the chamber still breathed with what had been spoken in the night, and long after bodies cooled, the whispers remained, lingering like the scent of perfume on a lover's neck, impossible to wash away. For in the end, history remembers battles, crowns, and betrayals written in ink and blood. But behind those, stories hidden in silk and sweat are the true beginnings. Secrets shared in darkness, whispered in trembling voices between kisses that shaped the fate of kingdoms as surely as any sword. The castle had always been a place of stone and silence, its towers rising like jagged teeth against the night sky. but within its walls it breathed with life. The whisper of velvet skirts across flagstones, the clatter of goblets in the hall, the muttered prayers of priests in the chapel. Yet among all who walked those halls, it was not the king, nor his lords, nor even the queen who held the unseen threads of power. It was a woman, neither noble by blood nor sanctified by holy vows, whose shadow touched every chamber. She was known only as the mistress of the castle. Her real name was forgotten, if ever it had been known. Some said she was born the daughter of a merchant. Others whispered she had once been a lady-in-waiting. Still others swore she had been a peasant child raised among hedgerows and stolen bread. None of it mattered. For by the time her presence became undeniable, she had shed all traces of the girl she had been. What remained was a woman whose beauty was weapon enough to conquer hearts, whose charm could bend oaths sworn on steel, and whose skill in the art of listening gave her more power than any crown. Her ascent had not been sudden. She had come to the castle first as one of many. Another courtesan whose silks rustled faintly in the shadows of banquet halls, whose eyes promised pleasures hidden behind heavy curtains. At first, she was little different from the others. She danced when the minstrels played, laughed when men told their bawdy tales, and accompanied them upstairs when coin or favor changed hands. But unlike the others, she never allowed herself to be forgotten. When she laughed, it was low and rich, curling around a man's ears until it seemed only he had drawn it from her lips. When she danced, her steps wove closer than others dared, lingering just out of reach, so that desire grew sharp before it was satisfied. And when she spoke, she did not chatter or flatter idly. She asked questions, gentle, curious questions, that seemed harmless at first, but led men deeper and deeper until they found themselves spilling truths they had never intended to share. She knew when to listen, when to remain silent, and when to offer the softness of her lips to still a man's. Trembling, at first it won her gifts, rings with blood-red rubies, cloaks lined in fur, purses heavy with gold. But as years passed, it won her something greater: influence. A knight confided to her the shame of his illegitimate child. A baron confessed to her his debts, so steep they threatened to unmake his house. A young prince whispered to her of his hatred for his elder brother, the heir to the throne. She collected these secrets the way other women collected perfumes or combs. And unlike perfumes, they did not fade. She remembered every word. Her chamber became a throne of its own kind. Men entered it cloaked in power and dignity and left trembling, disheveled, and bound to her in ways they could never untangle. They called her their lover, their confidant, their solace. But she was more. She was a spider in the web of the castle, and her threads ran everywhere. The queen noticed first. Queens always notice. They are trained from childhood to see the way men's eyes stray, to hear the tremor in their voices when they speak of another woman. Yet the queen was not jealous in the way of common wives. She was wary. She watched as lords who once knelt quickly to her husband began to hesitate, as knights who once swore loyalty to the crown now lingered in the courtesan's presence, as alliances seemed to shift invisibly in the corridors. She saw the way the mistress's smile curved at court banquets, small and secret, as though she knew more than anyone else in the room. The queen hated her for it, but also feared her. The king, however, adored her. He called her his solace after the weariness of councils, his flame in the chill of winter, his peace when war raged beyond the walls. He gave her jewels that had once belonged to queens. He let her sit at his side when feasts grew long. He visited her chambers even when the court whispered of impropriety. Each time he left her bed, he left behind a little more of his power. She did not seize it. It was given, willingly, in gasps and moans and whispers in the dark. The other women in the castle hated her too, not for her beauty. There were many beautiful women, but for the way she made beauty seem irrelevant. They adorned themselves with paints and jewels, with brocade gowns that cost a year's harvest, yet still they paled when she entered a room. She could wear nothing but a simple shift and still command the gaze of every man. They whispered she was a witch, that her charms were unnatural, that she had struck a bargain with the devil himself. But if so, the devil was generous, for her power only grew. Her chamber became a sanctuary for the desperate. Men who feared disgrace, ruin, or betrayal came to her not for lust alone, but for counsel. She listened, stroked their hair, let them spill their fears into her arms, and in return she offered whispers of advice. Her advice was never cruel, never overt, but always binding. A knight who confessed fear of dishonor found himself urged to take one more duel. A lord who feared losing favor was guided to offer gifts in her name. A young prince, reckless with rage, was soothed into patience until she decided it was time for his rage to break. Slowly, softly, she guided them all, until entire factions in the castle bent to her will without ever realizing it. She had no army, no title, no inheritance. Yet when she spoke, men obeyed. Her beauty was not eternal. No woman's is. Lines crept at the corners of her eyes. Her hair lost the deep sheen of youth. Her voice grew huskier with age. But it did not matter. By then, her power lay not in beauty, but in secrets. She had been the pillow upon which 100 noble heads had rested. She knew every scandal, every hidden desire, every whispered crime. She could have brought down the king with a word. She could have made or broken marriages, named or shamed heirs, unmade alliances with a single breath. No beauty could rival that, and she knew it. When she walked through the great hall, men lowered their eyes, not from modesty, but from fear that she might speak of what they had once confessed in the darkness. When she sat at banquets, women grew stiff, fearing she might reveal something of their husbands. She was both adored and loathed, both desired and feared. She was, in truth, the mistress of the castle, not by title, but by dominance of every whisper that passed within its walls, yet her reign was not without danger. Power without crown is a fragile thing. Queens can command armies, courtesans can only command men's hearts, and hearts are fickle. She understood this, and so she walked carefully. She never bragged of her influence. She never threatened openly. She was soft words, gentle laughter, and knowing glances. She left her true power unseen, like the roots of a tree hidden beneath the earth, vast and unshakable, even if invisible. Still, there were those who plotted against her. A faction of noble women conspired to disgrace her, planting rumors of witchcraft and treason. They bribed servants to claim she held black rites in her chamber, that she brewed potions and read fortunes in blood. For a time, the whispers gained traction. Priests muttered of purges, lords urged the king to cast her out. But she survived, as she always had, not through force but through subtlety. She reminded the king of the nights she had soothed him when all others failed. She reminded him of the secrets he had spilled in her bed. And most of all, she reminded those who plotted against her of the secrets she carried, secrets that could ruin them with a single word. One by one, her enemies fell silent. Her power peaked in a winter of famine, when the castle nearly starved. The lords quarreled over dwindling stores, the queen wept over starving peasants, and the king grew desperate. But the mistress whispered to him in the quiet of her chamber, and by morning his decisions were changed. Food was rationed differently. Alliances with merchants were struck, and the crisis passed. None knew that the true ruler in that winter had been the woman in silk sheets. By then, she was legend. Servants whispered of her in awe, nobles avoided her gaze, and soldiers dreamed of her in secret. They called her the Whispering Queen, though she wore no crown. Her end, when it came, was not from poison or sword, but from time. Power won through. Beauty and secrets cannot last forever. A younger courtesan entered the castle as cunning as she had once been, and slowly the balance shifted. Men who once came only to her chamber now lingered elsewhere. Whispers that had once been hers alone now flowed to other ears, and though she still had secrets, their weight grew lighter as years passed, for new scandals always replaced the old. Yet even in decline, she remained formidable. When she finally withdrew from the castle, no one quite knew where she went. She left behind a legacy that outlived kings. For decades after, whenever a noble grew too loose-lipped in bed, people would mutter, "Remember the mistress of the castle." Whenever a woman rose high by her charms, they whispered, "Another mistress is born." She became more myth than woman, her. True story lost beneath the legends spun around her name. The castle's stones outlasted her flesh, but its halls never forgot her shadow. She had been more dangerous than an army, more cunning than a council, and more enduring than a crown. She had ruled in silence, in silk, in secrets. And for a time she had ruled more completely than any king. And in the stillness of those chambers where she once lay, some said her presence lingered. Lovers who dared the bedchambers late at night swore they heard a woman's low laughter in the dark, soft and knowing, as if reminding them that secrets, once spoken in the night, are never truly gone. The great halls of castles grew quieter as centuries passed. Tapestries rotted, stones crumbled, and noble bloodlines thinned into nothing more than names in dusty scrolls. But within those walls, something less tangible remained. A resonance, an echo that could not be measured in walls or measured in crowns. It was the echo of women whose lives had been concealed in shadows, whose bodies and beauty had been currency, and whose passions had shaped the course of kings and kingdoms. Their names were seldom written in chronicles, monks in their scriptoria, inked long passages on the piety of queens, the valor of knights, the cunning of lords. But seldom did they mention the courtesans who bent knights' loyalties with a kiss, the women who whispered into the ears of princes until decisions were altered, the prostitutes whose silk sheets became the true battlegrounds of power. To write them down would have been to admit that history itself was not shaped only by swords and crowns, but also by the arch of a brow, the press of lips, the secrets exchanged in breathless whispers in darkened chambers. And so their legacies became hidden, but hidden does not mean lost. Every castle carried them still, like ghosts lingering in its stones. In the silence of ruined bedchambers, one could almost imagine the rustle of skirts drawn hastily aside, the low laughter of women who knew their power, the sighs of men undone by passion. The mistress of the castle was not the only one. She was but the most remembered. There had been countless others. Red-haired seductresses with tempers that burned like fire, quiet, dark-eyed beauties who listened better than priests, women with golden hair and golden tongues who turned pillow talk into politics. Their bodies were flesh, but their influence was something more enduring, something spectral, woven into the fabric of medieval life. Consider the way knights spoke in their confessions to priests. Priests, sworn to secrecy, recorded no names, but noted the trembling, the guilt, the longing. How many battles were fought by men distracted by the thought of a courtesan's smile? How many treaties were sealed not in ink but in sweat, beneath canopy beds draped in velvet? How many rebellions were quelled not by armies, but by a woman's whispered promise that she would remain if a man stayed loyal to his lord? In the margins of medieval power, these women thrived. They learned to balance beauty with cunning, desire with survival. They painted their faces with crushed berries and soot, perfumed their hair with lavender and rosemary, tightened their waists until breath itself was a luxury, all in service of being unforgettable. Yet beneath that surface lay something sharper, an intelligence that mapped every fragile thread of a man's soul, tugging at it with skill until he was bound tighter than by any chain of steel. Their legacy was not only in power, but in the shaping of love itself. The very notion of medieval romance, the knight who rode into danger for the sake of a lady's glance, the troubadour who sang beneath a window for the kiss of a noble beauty, was not born solely of noble marriages. It was kindled in the warmth of courtesans' chambers, in the quiet exchanges of women who taught men what it meant to yearn, to ache, to surrender. It was in the way they touched with tenderness after passion, reminding even hardened warriors that gentleness had a place. It was in the way they taught princes that loyalty could not be demanded, only earned through intimacy. And yet, desire is dangerous. These women knew it more than anyone. Beauty was both a blessing and a curse. A courtesan could rise to power unmatched, holding secrets that could unmake dynasties. But she could also fall overnight, discarded when youth faded or when jealous rivals spread poison in whispers. Many ended their days in cloisters, their beauty veiled by vows, or in poverty, their silks traded for rags. Some met darker fates, burned, as witches, drowned in rivers, exiled to distant lands, punished for the very allure that had once been celebrated. The echo of their lives was not only one of passion but of peril, a reminder that to wield desire was to dance always at the edge of ruin. Still, their presence endured. In every castle archive there are gaps, missing parchments, erased names, margins left suspiciously blank. And in those silences, one can hear them most clearly. For it is in what is unwritten that their power lingers. The mistress of the castle, the nameless beauties, the whispered lovers, they did not need chronicles to immortalize them. They were immortalized in the choices of kings swayed by lust, in the jealousies that sparked feuds, in the betrayals that toppled thrones. The echo of their desires resounded in every coronation, every rebellion, every treaty signed beneath, banners of peace. And their secrets linger still. Walk through the ruins of a medieval chamber, and you will see where tapestries once hung to muffle the moans of lovers. Look at the grooves worn into stone staircases, where women slipped barefoot, to midnight trysts. Study the graffiti scratched into castle walls by bored squires, and you may find initials entwined, marks of affairs long forgotten but never erased. These small remnants speak louder than the silence of official histories. They tell us that, behind every noble name in the annals of time, there was a shadowed figure. A woman whose body carried both pleasure and power. The legacy of beauty and passion they left behind shaped more than politics. It shaped the very way we understand desire. The idea that longing is dangerous, that beauty must be controlled, that women's sexuality is both feared and coveted, these notions are medieval inheritances. They were born in those bedchambers, in those whispered nights, when secrets were exchanged as freely as caresses. The mistress of the castle, in her decline, knew this. She knew that even when her silks faded and her lovers grew old, the echoes of her desires would outlast her flesh. And she was right. Her legend lingered, not as a single story, but as a warning, a fascination, a myth retold by servants, by noblewomen in jealous whispers, by soldiers as they sharpened their swords. Her presence became a lesson, that no throne was truly safe from the power of beauty, that no king was beyond the reach of passion's snare. And so the castles themselves became haunted by these women, not by their ghosts alone, but by the memory of what they represented. In every candlelit corridor, one could imagine the flutter of a gown, the scent of perfume, the touch of fingers on stone. In every noble's sigh, there was a memory of them. In every song sung of tragic love, there was a shadow of their truth. History may not name them, but it cannot silence them. For every king crowned, every battle fought, every dynasty remembered carries within it an echo of their influence. Their beauty may have been forgotten, their bodies long decayed, but their desires shaped a hidden history as real and enduring as the stones of the castles themselves. And if you listen closely, in the stillness of night, you can almost hear them still. The laughter, the whispers, the moans half hidden by heavy curtains. Echoes of forgotten desires, lingering in the dark, shaping the world long after the women themselves were gone.